Stephanie Kelton, Taya Harvey, our longtime director who did all of the heavy lifting, Bob Hockett, Cornell Law School, and assisted in extremely important ways. We opened this symposium this morning under dramatic circumstances. The arrival in January of a new Congress with an open strategic path, open in a way that I think we have not seen in quite a few years. The question before the country is, what should that Congress do? Our position, exemplified by this symposium, is that it should set to work on a program, on an actual governing agenda to secure peace and justice. The elements of that program will be discussed throughout the morning, and I simply want to highlight three that seem to me to be especially important. First, to strengthen Social Security, to move toward universal health insurance, to guarantee jobs to all who wish to have them, and to improve wages, especially to achieve a much higher federal minimum wage. Second, to face and meet the need to transform and rebuild our national infrastructure, especially to fight climate change while preserving and improving the quality of life. In other words, to set the strategic direction for the evolution of the national economy and society for the generations ahead. And third, and this is especially important to the mission of EPS, to face and accept the danger, the futility of reckless, aggressive posturing on the world stage, to change the structure and the mission of our military so as to meet our actual security needs, to recognize and accept the reality of the world in which we live, which includes the presence of other great and rising powers, and to realize that we cannot have dominance and stable security at the same time. Throughout history, no power ever has or ever will achieve those two goals at the same time. So we stand with Mikhail Gorbachev, who spoke yesterday on this point, and with the spirit of Ronald Reagan, that to say firmly that we should not be in a new Cold War. I will close, because this is a dramatic moment, with a reference to my favorite text from American political history, the message that Abraham Lincoln sent to Congress in December of 1862. A passage that reads, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." And the final words I wish to quote strike me as particularly wonderful and fitting for our moment were these. Lincoln said, "The way is plain, peaceful, generous, just." And in that spirit, I would like to call the symposium to order, ask the first panel to take their places, and I'm going to yield the chair of the first panel to the chair of the Board of Economists for Peace and Security, Professor Stephanie Kelton. Thank you very much.
slides.
Good morning, everyone. While I do some last-minute housekeeping here with our speakers, thank you, everybody, for coming out for this event. We think it's an important one. We do it every year at this time. Many of you have come in years past, and we're happy to have you back. And some of you maybe are here for the first time, and we're delighted to have you as well. Our panelists this morning are going to speak to us about where we think we can make some headway in the coming years with a new administration on a variety of policy fronts. And I'm very happy to be able to introduce Mehrsa Baradaran to my left, Elieen Applebaum from the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Mehrsa is at the University of Georgia Law School, and Bill Lazonick at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. So I think I've decided, Bill, maybe you'll kick us off.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thanks. Great to be here. I have some slides. Actually, I just last May retired from the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Retired from teaching. I run a nonprofit called the Academic Industry Research Network, and a lot of the research I present here is being done there through funding, a lot of funding from, fortunately, from the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And I've got a great team of researchers working on this. Okay, you have these slides up?
Next slide, sir.
Huh? Is it there? Oh.
Say your thing and it'll go.
Very good.
There you go.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the role of the corporation, the need for policy related to corporate governance, and actually there is some policy being put forward now related to corporate governance, as I'll get to at the end. Okay, if we want to talk about a just economy, we want equitable and stable economic growth. We want growth, productivity growth. Want it to be stable, but equitable. You know, that's actually a squishier concept. But I think if we start looking, particularly start looking inside corporations, we see that it's not equitable. And in the past, there was something we could call a distribution of income in corporations that was more equitable. Unfortunately, it was mainly white males who benefited from that. And when white males stopped being a lot of the main recipients of this, or at least other groups, blacks and women in particular, started gaining access to the jobs that white males had, a lot of that started to disappear. So the main thrust of the arguments that I make is that if we want to understand income distribution, we have to understand, first of all, investment and productive capabilities. So this is actually a supply-side argument, but it's very different than the neoclassical supply-side argument because they don't have a theory of investment and productive capabilities. And I talk about households, governments, and businesses. These are all organizations that make these investments. And ultimately, we need businesses to invest in productive capabilities, which includes the productive capabilities of people first and foremost. Now, what we have now in corporations, and I would argue that this is the main area in which income distribution gets played out, is what I've been calling predatory value extraction. I have a book coming out with a colleague named Jang Suk Shin, who's in Korea and who's in Singapore, where we have developed some of the analysis I'll show you today very quickly. But it's basically extreme income inequality, where people who are extracting value and from within business corporations who have very little contribution to make to that value. And that includes a lot of senior executives, investment bankers, Wall Street bankers, and hedge fund managers. Okay, now everybody knows these data on income distribution. This is one that appeared in the New York Times a little while ago, based on the tax return data that Piketty and Say's use, where the gray line is 1946 to 1980, and the gains of different groups on the horizontal axis is percentiles of the income distribution, and as you can see, the bottom gained over that 34-year period. Then they compared 1980 to 2014, and you can see in that red line who's making the gains. This is the EPI data. A lot of people use these data on the gap between productivity and pay. My main argument is that this is something that's really driven by a massive change in the way income is distributed within companies, what relationship between productivity and pay. These data are from the Census Bureau. There are more recent data, but they only every 5 years they show revenues. But they don't change that much from year to year. It's become a little more concentrated. But basically, if you take that pink line, 5,000 companies averaging over 20,000 employees, that's within the United States. 5,000 employees or more, 1,900 companies. They have about 34% of the employment in the business sector, 38% of the payroll, and 44% of the revenues. What they do or do not do with their money, with their profits, with their resources, affects the way the whole economy operates. The research that came to this notion by looking at within corporations, and I started noticing in the late 80s, basically, the companies were doing all these stock buybacks. And I said, why are they doing them in addition to dividends? And I've watched it since then, and it's become worse and worse and worse. It's this year, it's estimated that just the S&P 500 companies will do $800 billion to $1 trillion in buybacks. And a lot of that is, that'll be by far a record. The highest level was about $600 billion in 2007, and that was almost equal in 2015. But this is also fueled in addition by the tax cuts. I got a lot of visibility for these arguments in a paper an article I had published in Harvard Business Review about 4 years ago. The important part is the subtitle there: Stock Buybacks Manipulate the Market and Leave Most Americans Worse Off. So I helped change Harvard Business Review for a while, at least, into a radical economics journal. I was sure that they were going to get rid of that subtitle. They told me at the last minute, the last change was we have to change the subtitle. And I had how stock buybacks manipulate the market. They just took out the how. So that got a lot of visibility. And I think that actually there are a lot of people within corporations who understood that they shouldn't be doing this and that this was causing great damage to the corporation. Now, the general argument I have is that we've gone from an era when you had slightly more trend to income equality post-World War II of when companies retained and reinvested. You had career employment within companies. You had a distribution of profits went back into keeping people employed, pay increases, better benefits, etc. Again, this was really a white male world. To a general trend to what I call downsize and distribute. Companies will slash wages, lay off people offshore. It doesn't matter how long they work there, and they distribute the cash to shareholders in the forms of dividends and increasingly buybacks. I made this argument in a Brookings paper that was a kind of derivative of the fact that the article was published in Harvard Business Review. That gave Brookings the right to publish something, or someone in Brookings wanted to do this. Most of the buybacks that are done are open market repurchases. They're nothing but a manipulation of the market. And the reason they're done is because of once obscure rule that I think I've helped to bring to light, called Rule 10b-18, that was adopted in November of 1982. And it was a direct result of Reagan getting elected and putting a Wall Street guy named John Shad at the head of the SEC. And basically the SEC argued, saw that, believed in Chicago economics, and the more money sloshing around in the economy, the more capital formation there is, which is nonsense, but I won't get into that in any detail. But here, this is the one article that appeared at the time. It's the only article. It was very informative. And you can see in the subtitle, agency assures it won't file charges of manipulation if certain rules are met. So it's basically on the books of the SEC that it could be manipulation. And this is something actually when it was adopted, there was no public comment on it at all. And it's never been vetted or ratified or legislated in any way by Congress. The critical thing here, there was some attempt to limit buybacks, which were more stringent, but still, in my view, would have allowed too much before Rule 10b-18. But the critical point is when they allow 25% of your average daily trading volume for the previous 4 weeks in any single day to be bought back, and it's a safe harbor, so that if you go above that amount, you won't necessarily be charged with manipulation. If you stay below that amount, you definitely won't be charged with manipulation. Basically, I call this basically a license to loot. Now, here, if you look at, recently I looked at the data, this means that Apple can do almost about 1.4 billion a day, day after day after day, in using up its stock price. This past year, Apple did 73 billion, a new record. It had set the previous record of 45 billion in 2014. And there are some of the other numbers of companies, how much they can do under the safe harbor. The fact is, there's a very good article by David Dyan, which he interviewed me for in 2015. The response to something I'll show you in a couple minutes, some letters from Tammy Baldwin, Senator, to the SEC asking why they were doing all this stuff and allowing it. And basically, Mary Jo White, who's pictured there, the chair of the SEC at the time, said, you can't violate Rule 10b-18 because it's a safe harbor. You can just avail yourself of it. And in fact, that the SEC doesn't even know the exact dates on which companies do buybacks. They don't have the data because they don't collect the data, and they never have. Okay. Here, if we take the same companies going back to 1981, if we go back before buybacks were minimal, you can see that buybacks, the blue part, has been piled on top, basically, of dividends. The dividends have not decreased, and these are in 2017 dollars. This is a little more complicated, just the payout ratios. This is for the last 10 years. Basically, $4 trillion. We look at the same companies going back in time, so the further back we go, the more companies we lose. They have to be listed over the whole period. $4 trillion in buybacks, about 53% of net income, plus about over 40% of net income in dividends. Then we look at the leading companies. And I like to say that we're only constrained by time, money, and people in doing research on this stuff, because we know how to dig into these companies and look at what they're doing and the damage that buybacks do. And that's where we really see this happening. And I'll give you very briefly just the example of the pharmaceutical industry, and this has gotten a lot of attention from people who are critical of high drug prices, access to medicine, people like doctors, like lawyers. They've seen the value of this research. We, as taxpayers, have funded life sciences research since they started recording the expenditures in 1938, over $1 trillion. The current budget is over $37 billion. And companies, this is basically a chart which is a little hard to read, but basically companies in the S&P 500, 19 pharmaceutical companies over the decade 2007-2016 spent something like $564 billion on buybacks and dividends, and it was about 16% more than spending on R&D. They say they need high drug prices in order to accelerate R&D, but that's not how they're using the high drug prices. There's much more I could say on that. I had a discussion with them before. These are Pfizer and Merck. You can see if you look at the BB plus DB over net income going back decades, they've been spending more than 100% of their net income on buybacks and dividends. That means they're laying off people, they're selling assets, whatever, eating into capital. Okay, I'll skip over some of this. There's a lot more than I could say about this, but I don't want to take too much time. We have an analysis now. This is in the book with Janice and Chin, which should be out in 6 to 7 months. Where we look at CEOs as the value extracting insiders. They're enabling all this. They accept the shareholder value ideology. This is what they should do with their money. This goes back to the mid-1980s. We have the institutional investors who have become the enablers. And then increasingly important are the hedge fund activists who are hugely powerful and can rip apart a company like GE going on now with less than 1% of the shares through what is a really corrupt proxy voting system that most people don't know much about, and which I won't try to explain now for lack of time. We look at these are the 500 highest paid CEOs. executives, not CEOs, each year from 2008 to 2017. And you can see the orange and purple part, that's stock-based pay. That's what incentivizes them to do buybacks. And by the way, these are the correct data. Almost all the data reported, even by the AFL-CIO, unfortunately, on their executive pay watch database are phony data based on Black-Scholes work, and option pricing models are just junk. And these are the correct data. We know what they actually get paid, but they're not used. That's another story. Here's the institutional investors, and here's the hedge funds. Some of the names you'll know, but the ones underlined are the activists. Someone just sent me a note from who was on Japan. Daniel Loeb is ripping apart a company, Fanuc, one of the great Japanese companies now. Paul Singer is in Germany ripping apart ThyssenKrupp, which is one of the oldest steel companies. And actually, they don't know what to do about it in those countries. They're not prepared for this. Just here are the top 15 hedge fund managers average about 5 times the pay of the remuneration of the top 15 corporate executives in 2016. Okay, there's a critique of this, which I basically don't have time to get into in any detail, but it's basically that shareholders don't really contribute to companies, just buy and sell shares, and everybody should know that. And the fact that people will go around calling shareholders investors, they own companies, where do you get fake news from? I mean, the stock market does not play that role. It actually does not play the role of funding companies. It plays the role of allowing us as households to find some way to try to get a yield on our income if companies do well. It's workers and taxpayers, basically, who are funding companies, taking the risks, taxpayers through things like the NIH and all the infrastructure and knowledge that companies use. Okay, so, in the mid-1980s, or starting really in the 1970s, people came along and said, no, that money belongs to shareholders, disgorge the cash flow, more efficient allocation of resources. It's not really about ownership, it's about efficient allocation of resources, and that's what's happening. And that really justified buybacks. This shows the hits in the Wall Street Journal on shareholder value, really from the mid-1980s. Oops. Okay, let me just, I only have about a minute left, so let me just go to some stuff at the end. Okay, this, just a half a minute on this. There's a well-known article by Milton Friedman that 1970 New York Times, but the only social responsibility of a business is to increase its profits. I always thought it was nonsense. Milton Friedman knew nothing about how corporations work. There was someone whose son is here who's knew a lot about how corporations worked at the time, but Milton Friedman wasn't paying any attention to what John Kenneth Galbraith was saying. But it's worse than that. Basically, this guy here is the chairman of GM, and he was fighting off a Nader-inspired campaign GM that wanted to put public interest representatives on boards. And that was overwhelmingly defeated at the annual meeting where he's pictured in May of 1970. And then the editor of the New York Times recruited Friedman to publish this article, and where he said that basically what was going on, I have it on another slide, that this argument about social responsibility and the reason they needed the public interest representatives was because of fuel efficiency and safety, was that was pure and unadulterated socialism. This is actually, there were 13 members of Congress who were behind this, including that's Shirley Chisholm, mostly in the New York area, who were pushing for people, public interest people on boards. Now, the important thing to take from this is that if we know what happened in the auto industry from 1970 on, it wasn't just social responsibility, it was innovation. If you wanted to be a leader in the auto industry, you had to deal with safety and fuel efficiency. These were two in dimension, and this is something that GM didn't do. So they should have put those people on the board back in 1970. And basically what Friedman was telling people, coming from his point of view, and this is the clarion call for shareholder value, according to everybody, was companies should not be innovative, and they should not try to address the needs of the people, not just the workers, but of the people they're supposed to be selling their products to. Okay, so what we have is basically a theory of value extraction, like a predatory value extraction, And I guess the subtitle of this meeting is Advice to Congress. And fortunately, some members of Congress get it, and some have been reelected. And the person who's got it most is Tammy Baldwin. And I've worked with Brian Conlon, who has one of her staffers since 2015. I was contacted. We've basically been discussing this, and it's ongoing, about the problem. And she sent 2 very probing letters to Mary Jo White, the SEC, saying, what the hell's going on here? And why are you allowing this? And that's where that article came out, for example, that said that the SEC doesn't even have the data to monitor it. You can't violate the Rule 10b-18. Okay. She's also used our stuff on the pharmaceutical industry to go after the pharmaceutical lobby. And the Senate Democrats have just about a year ago started embracing the buybacks research as a response to the tax cuts. Last June, 21 senators sent a letter to the SEC talking about the damage the buybacks do and asking for a period of comment. Clayton, the SEC chair, has evaded that. There's the signatures. All of them are back except Donnelly. Tammy Baldwin introduced the Reward Work Act, which would rescind Rule 10b-18 and have all corporations have 1/3 of their board members be worker representatives. And Elizabeth Warren, and this is something that Bob Pocket was working on, and I was providing some comments on drafts. The Accountable Capitalism Act, which is focused mainly on about 1,900 companies with about $1 billion in revenues or more, have 40% of their board members be elected by workers, and also restrict executive pay and cashing in on stock-based pay. And the last thing I'll say is that if these were to go through, what we need would be a huge educational process for those representatives about why they should be doing things differently than not, because if they don't have that the analysis, they're going to get hammered by the people who are just saying buybacks are great and that maximize shareholder value. Thanks.
So Stephanie asked me actually to not present, but to give actual just advice to Congress. So I'm going to do that. So I'll just sit and talk very informally. So I think there's, before I get to the sort of actionable plans to Congress, I want to talk about 3 myths that I think we need to get over before we can sort of move forward. And it's great that he brought up Milton Friedman, because I think so much of the wrong thinking on policy came during that era, not just Friedman, but Greenspan and Goldwater and Nixon. And so I've talked about it quite at length in my histories of this era, but I want to kind of boil it down to 3 different things. And one is that the myth of sort of expertise and models as the way to sort of understand money, right? That money is this sort of platonic ideal out there that our modeling and our data can sort of conceive of, as opposed to money as a result, money and credit, I should say, and wealth as a result of democratic decision making. And so this is, I do banking, that's my focus. Banking policy is government policy. Banking and governments have been umbilically sort of tied together across the world and across US history. And for much of our history, and you see this up until the 1970s, policy decisions in banking were very much in the realm of public discussion, right? So you have presidential debates centering on monetary policy. And we sort of make fun right now of the William Jennings Bryan cross of gold, but the gold-silver debate was at the heart of politics at a certain time, right? What is that about but not monetary policy and credit expansion? And I've taken track of debates recently, and banking and monetary policy never comes up. And this is because of the turn in the 1970s with the Greenspan sort of data, right? Data will fix it. And I'm reading Volcker's new memoir, and he also understands that the model sort of, this is how you understand money. The more you sort of study the modeling and the data, the more you can sort of conceive of monetary policy. And I think that is a mistake. And I think it is the reason why the banking crisis turned into a political crisis, because though every policymaker, and I've read every one of these memoirs as well, every policymaker, Geithner, Bernanke, Paulson, feels like they did the work, and they fixed it, they solved it. Yet everyone on the outside feels like they were hoodwinked and sort of sold a lie. And so I think this is what we need to encounter. Those of us who work in policy and the experts need to understand that is something that is a result of the way that the technocracy sort of took over the solutions. I don't know if you all have watched The Big Short. I've seen it once. My students, I teach banking law every year. My students are obsessed with this film. In fact, I ask them, why do you take banking? And they say, because of The Big Short. And that's their understanding of the banking crisis. And I think it's unfortunate. However, it is what it is. And at the end, I just was reminded, because one of my students used it in her presentation yesterday in class, at the end of The Big Short, I don't know if you recall, but at the end of The Big Short, there's this like ending where Ryan Gosling says, and then they fixed the crisis and then put a bunch of bankers in jail, and they, the SEC did these reforms, and and then they, and now we've not had a return to standard order. He's like, just kidding. They blamed Black and brown people and immigrants, and nothing was done. And it was actually jarring to see that, because I had forgotten that was the ending. But I think that is the solution. That is the missed path that a lot of my students, at least, think, like put people in jail. And I actually don't think that was the response, but that's what a lot of the public was expecting. And so I think this idea of money as a democratic sort of, the credit policy and banking policy needs to be something that we debate in the public forum, as opposed to a realm of just federal research. So that's the first myth. The second myth is my focus on inequality and specifically the racial wealth gap. And so the myth here is that we, the civil rights era sort of fixed the problems of the past, and I like to refer to the civil rights laws as deregulation, because that's what they were. Even though Milton Friedman and the libertarians opposed the Civil Rights Act, what the Civil Rights Act did was to regulate away the Jim Crow era barriers that restricted free market entry to the Black population for a century, right? That was not capitalism. And so, in studying the racial wealth gap and just general economic inequality, you can trace every sort of gap back to some federal government program, the FHA redlining or the Homestead Act, and things like that. And so I think, the last sort of stage of the Civil Rights Act, the FHA and what was going to happen after 1968 got halted. And so we still have a lot of work to do in that remedy. So that's the second myth, is that we fixed those inequalities. And I talk about that in the book. So the third is to the solutions. And I think the myth to get over here is banking or I should say, the myth that community banking or local banking is the answer to poverty or for marginalized communities. And this also stems from that sort of libertarian / law and econ movement, although this goes back to Thomas Jefferson. So I think there's a lot of villains for this myth. But banking is federal, banking is national. It has not maybe always been, but when we pretended that it wasn't, we had problems like post-Jackson era, or when we were an agrarian society, maybe it worked to have sort of localism in banks. But any sort of localism in banking has been a highly regulated industry, right? So we have unit banking, we have geographic restrictions. That is the only way that local banks were able to thrive. But the model of the George Bailey Bank or the Jeffersonian sort of community bank that lifts up a poor community by pooling resources, that was all underwritten by the FHA guaranteed mortgages, by FDIC insurance, by Federal Reserve liquidity loans, by regulatory sort of infrastructure by the federal government. So I think when we're talking about solutions, over the last 30 years, for any solution for inequality, racial wealth gap, redlining, it has always been local. CRA, CDFI, those are all well-meaning laws pushed by progressives and Democrats, but I think we need to stop that. It's not working. And the reason it's not working is because the reason why the problems exist is not because of the lack of local entrepreneurship. It has been federal oversight and federal, actually, decision-making that has left pockets of the country. So So as far as solutions, one that I proposed in previous books is reviving postal banking. So we've got a lot of banking deserts, unbanked populations. All banking is federal, payments, credit, linking it up to the postal banks, which we've had in the country for from 1910 until 1966. Every other developed country has had it or currently operates it. So just allowing people to have small savings accounts or access to credit through the postal bank. That's one. Two, but that's a small thing. I think it's not a costly and it's a very sort of easy to remedy solution. The other are sort of bigger inequality type things, and this is where money and credit, I think, going back to the first myth, need to take an active role. The Federal Reserve policy or congressional policy in sort of understanding the federal government's role in bringing up the bottom here, in reducing inequality, specifically race-based segregation. And so I've proposed a couple things. So, something like a 21st Century Homestead Act, where you have the Federal Reserve, in the way that the Federal Reserve bought up toxic assets for AIG, buying up assets from cities like Detroit or Baltimore that are abandoned properties, and then adding some sort of development funds into those and allowing cities through a partnership to turn those over to residents and being able to sort of overcome those gaps. FHA type programs where you're talking about shared equity mortgages with borrowers in these communities, and public FISC, so public banking, but retooled the way that the FHA was, and going away from this sort of zero-sum thinking in policies, right? So taking taxes from the top and giving them to the bottom. I totally support taxing sort of estates and top, but also in using the Federal Reserve monetary policy tools in inequality. I think that's vital, is the way that credit works, the way that the FHA worked is to put a ton of money as an investment and do a long-term sort of hold on some of these things with the idea that it would come back and it would be a revolving fund. So I'm happy to talk more about those later, but that is it. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm very happy to be here. And I'm going to take my theme from something that Jamie said in his opening remarks. The problems have been with us for a while now. We know what they are. I'm talking now about the rise of inequality, the stagnant wages. But I think it would help us to think anew and act anew on these issues. And I'm going to propose looking at them through a slightly different lens than we've looked at them in the past. The thing about the stagnant wages and rising inequality, declining economic security, is that it's overdetermined. There are lots of causes that we can point to that can explain this. And of course, chief among them is the decline in private sector union membership and bargaining power. So let me just say that at the outset. But I think that we can learn something by looking at the wage stagnation and rising inequality through a somewhat different lens. And I want to focus in my remarks on two things: the fissuring of the labor market and the financialization of corporations. And my remarks there will be complementary to what Bill had to say. The thing that we can see is that the fissuring and financialization also began in the late 80s, late 70s, with changes in regulations, some of which Bill already referenced, and I'm not going to go into what they were, but that made these developments possible. And so they have occurred simultaneously with the rise in inequality. And I think it would behoove us to pay attention to them, number one. But number two, they also help us think about what would be the priorities. If you're going to think about a coherent set of policies to address rising inequality, rising economic insecurity, what would be the coherent set of policies you would like to start with? I have a much longer list than the ones I'm going to talk about today. But looking at it through this lens has helped me think about what are the most important things that this Congress needs to begin doing. So let me just say a few words about fishery. What do I mean by fishery? So the dominant corporations, these large, hierarchical, vertically integrated corporations, I mean, the steel mills used to own the iron ore, the trains that moved everything, right? Really integrated. And what has happened is over the last 40 years, what these companies want to do is they want to focus on their core competencies. They were not able to really do this before because we didn't have the kinds of technology that allowed them to monitor all of the people that they could now contract with. But with the technologies that exist today, it is now as inexpensive to monitor, maybe even cheaper, to monitor contractors than it is to actually have a hierarchy and manage your workforce internally. So the costs of these things have shifted. And what many companies are doing is they're holding on to core competencies. And what do they mean by that? They manage the brand, they do the R&D, they set the standards for production, and they set standards for consumer services, the way McDonald's does, for example, with its franchisees. That contract tells them how they're going to manage their workforce, how they're going to address their customers, and they're carefully monitored on all of this. So these are the core competencies that the firms maintain. And then they contract out for everything else. And so you have these networks to get to the final product or the final service. You have a network of firms, not necessarily a formal network. I usually refer to it as an ecosystem because they don't think of themselves as a network, but they're all contracting with some dominant company that can set the terms of these contracts. And so you have both concentration over the last 40 years in industries among these dominant firms, and then you have this fishering. You have tons of small companies that are out there competing for these contracts. They frequently go to the lowest bidder. So you have all of this fragmentation going on. If the contract goes to the lowest bidder, then the contract companies are operating on very narrow margins. And even if they want to pay their workers more, they can't pay their workers more because then they don't get the contract and nobody has a job. And so, in many cases, you have workers working side by side at a workplace who are on the payroll of different companies. And the example I like to give is, because it's not what you often think about, you go to the hospital, the security guard in the lobby, the person who took your insurance information, admissions, the person who brings you your food, the person who cleans your room, and the anesthesiologist who is assisting your surgeon are all employed by, and the person who handles your billing questions afterwards, are all employed by different companies. They work side by side in this hospital, and none of them are on the payroll of the hospital. That's how you end up with balance billing, but that's another story. That bill from the anesthesiologist in the hospital was in your system. But okay, anyway, the thing is that it's a low bid that got them that contract, and so their wages are going to be squeezed. And not everybody who is working for a contract company is physically at the workplace. So if you think about the commercial laundry that's doing the linens, those commercial laundries are also competing for these contracts and end up operating on margins and unable to pay workers. So that's the fishering. And that, I think, people we don't appreciate it because we don't have data on it. These folks all show up as workers in standard employment relationships. Yes, I go to work at the laundry. Yes, I'm employed by a security company. Yes, I'm employed by a hospitalist company. Oh, but I would actually another story. But anyway, they're all regular employees. They do not show up in our data, and we do not have a good way to really track the growth of it. If you ask me afterwards, I can tell you we can see the traces of it, but I don't want to take time for that now. I want to move over to financialization, and my remarks here will be complementary to Bill's. I mean, one of the other things that was going on, of course, is that the managerial capitalist enterprise, which is what you were describing as the older way of doing things, where you had people who are interested in the sustainability of the company and in producing goods and services that people might want. This reached its apogee in the late 1970s with the diversified conglomerate. And the diversified conglomerate was also its death knell in a way, because you can't really manage it. These managers who are used to managing related lines of business did not have the industry knowledge or the skills to manage these diversified conglomerates. So profitability was way down. And in addition, the only metrics that you can use across these diversified conglomerates are financial metrics. So with the use of financial metrics and profits going down, the finance people, the CFO, became the most important person in the corporation. And they have a whole different view of things. And you see them now, diversifying, getting rid of lines of business and selling out of things and so on. Over the 1980s, the balance of power shifted from a stakeholder view of the model of the corporation to one in which nothing mattered except for maximizing returns for shareholders. And as I said before, a lot of these things have many sources behind them. But one of them is the fact that the managerial model had just gone haywire and finance people took over, and that balance of power shifted. And again, once you're now focused on your returns, you find yourself again focusing on core competencies, selling off or shutting down lines of business that you don't view as core, and outsourcing major functions, payroll, benefits, purchasing, what you might think of as major functions of a corporation are now being outsourced. And again, companies are told the business strategy is focus on your core competencies, get rid of everything else. And in this context, labor becomes an input like any other. It's no longer an asset, it's a cost to be managed. And I have been on panels where corporate people have said outright, the last thing I want to do is hire a worker. Put those workers on somebody else's payroll. Workers think that they should have paid family leave, they should have paid sick days, they want an increase of pay. They're a pain in the neck. Get them off my payroll. And they've actually said it. If we look at we want to look at shareholder value on steroids, it would be the private equity model. And Bill was talking about a license to loot. There is no greater license to loot than the private equity business model. So famously, they have no commitment to sustainability. They want to be in and out in 3 to 5 years. The heart of this model is the leveraged buyout, where they take money from pension funds, foundations, wealthy investors, pool them in a private equity fund, use the private equity firm, just so you will know, puts in $1 to $2 for every $100 the pension funds put in. And so they have very little skin in the game. By the time you end up buying a business with 70% debt, they have 0.6% of the purchase price at risk. I mean, they have no risk, and they easily recoup it long before the 3 years are up. Not to worry about them; they're making their money. And so, what they do is they buy the private equity fund is the down payment on the business that they're buying. They load it up with 70% debt. They put usually about 30% down, 70% in debt. And the debt is on the company that they bought. People always ask me, is that legal? In the UK, they actually had to pass a law to make it legal. In the US, it's already legal. Nobody noticed it until 1979 with the buyout of Huday. But anyway, once they noticed it, no problem for these finance guys to figure out how they're going to do it. So the debt multiplies the returns to the private equity firm, but it also puts the company they bought at risk. And the first thing this company has to do is it has to increase its cash flow in order to make the interest payments on the debt. And how can you quickly increase cash flow? You sell off businesses even if they're profitable. You lay off workers. You look for concession bargaining if there's a union there. You cut benefits. All of these things are the fastest way to raise that cash flow, to make the interest payments. And you say to the workers, if we don't make these payments, nobody has a job. It's your choice. So no choice at all, of course. And then they pile more debt on the company in order to pay themselves dividends. That's how the private equity firm gets back its 0.6% of the purchase price. That happens really quickly. And they have many other ways. You've probably, if you read anything about Toys R Us, you saw all the ways that the private equity firms enriched themselves. The company went under, the workers got nothing. We're still fighting for severance for them. But the private equity guys, they all made money on this deal. They don't like to drive companies into bankruptcy. That's not their goal. But I always say that when they sell those companies, that's the second bite of the apple. The private equity firm already made its money back. Now they're getting the second bite, and they make a lot of money that way too. So thinking about these things, what then become the priorities for dealing with the stagnation and rising inequality? They're not a mystery. I don't like have some policies you never heard of. But I think the first thing is we have to establish minimum employment standards. And day one is that $15 an hour federal minimum wage. I think that's really important. Increasing eligibility for overtime, guaranteeing severance payments. One of the things about this country is that it costs a company nothing to lay off its workers. So why wouldn't you just lay them off? That's cost-free. If you had severance that was related to years of service, you would have to make other decisions. And Toys is a really good example. Okay, it was the private equity companies that loaded them with debt. It was the creditors who thought they would get more out of just liquidating. And there was no calculation there. If you had to pay severance to 33,000 workers, many of whom were there for 25 and 30 years, your calculation as a creditor would have been very different. You would never have thought to liquidate. You would have said, what can we do to make this work? How do we restructure? Or we're not going to get anything out of this. So severance, which has not gotten much attention in this country, is one of my key things we should be working on. The second thing is sharing prosperity through expanding the social wage. Again, no mysteries here, but you have all of these people who work in these little companies that are depending on contracts. Even if we had a strong union movement, it would be really difficult to organize them. They employ 20, 30 people. The resources it takes to unionize them would be enormous. And unions in the olden days and even today, we have not gotten paid family leave in any state without the support of a labor movement in that state. The labor movement may be little, but it's a big organization relative to many others and a really good partner on these things. So labor has always worked on the social wage, and we need to do more of that. And so on day two, the thing we have to do is preserve the Affordable Care Act, increase people's access to health care, expand coverage, especially all of the attacks on women's health. These things have to be rolled back. We need to expand the funding of community health centers. They are in the ACA. They were being funded. That funding is being cut back. We have to expand it. This is where people can get their primary care, have their chronic conditions like diabetes, blood pressure, other asthma, other chronic conditions managed, and where we can address the opioid crisis and put these things in rural areas that so desperately need them. These safety net hospitals, the hospitals with 25 beds in rural areas, have been closing down at an amazing rate. So we need to deal with that. We need to expand Medicare to, this is one of Jamie's proposals, to people from age 55 as a first step on the road to Medicare for all. A lot of these things will pass in the House. We'll put Republicans on notice, because if they can't vote for these things and the president can't sign them, it will be really clear that they are not the people that you want if you're a working person. And I think we set the table for Medicare for all in 2021, but also for many of the other things that we want. The third is to renew the national commitment to full employment and good jobs. This would be the infrastructure bill. We desperately need it. We need the infrastructure, and we need the good jobs. We need to make sure that they pay prevailing wage. We need to urge the Fed to strengthen the guidelines that limit the amount of debt on a company. They did have guidelines. They're not being enforced, and they need to be not just for banks, but for non-bank entities as well. And of course, we want the Fed to adopt policy leading to full employment, and we want to set the table for a federal jobs guarantee in 2021. We need to develop a definition of joint employer that will apply not only to franchise companies, but to many situations where you have a dominant firm that is setting the terms of employment in a contract company. And also, private equity firms ought to be joint employers for purposes of many of our laws. The joint employer one, I think, is really important. We need to reform our bankruptcy laws and move workers from the end of the line to the front of the line. the secure creditors get paid first, the vendors and the suppliers get paid second. If there's anything left over, workers may get their unpaid vacation time, wages they were owed, WARN Act payments. It hardly ever happens. So we need to do something about that. We need to strengthen workers' bargaining power through things like card check legislation, and also, as Phil also said, something that gets workers on the boards of these corporations. And the federal chartering thing that the act that Elizabeth Warren proposed, something where you federally charter them, they have a responsibility to put workers on their board. And the last thing I will say is oversight hearings, oversight. And it's not just about the president and his money laundering and his son or anything like that. But people care about his corruption. And there's a hell of a lot of it going on. So we need oversight on corruption. Sears would be my very first. It's not private equity, it's a hedge fund. So Sears is publicly traded. And that REIT that they set up to put all the good real estate in is also publicly traded. And both of these companies have the same chair, Eddie Lambert, and he runs the same hedge fund that is the major investor, shareholder in each of these other companies. Where the heck is the SEC? These are publicly traded companies. How can this go on? It's not even private equity. So Sears would be front and center, in my opinion. Everybody will understand the corruption that happened there. Sell off the best real estate to a REIT that then sells it to build all these developments and make tons of money. Also for Warren Buffett, by the way, who is a big investor in that REIT. So it wouldn't hurt to tarnish his reputation a little bit. And then wage theft. Wage theft is something else that everybody understands. Let us have a hearing on wage theft and why we're not doing enough about it. Bring in the regulators for these industries and ask them, what are you doing? And if you're not doing it, why not? We have companies that have been corrupt. We have workers in communities that were hurt. We have regulators that are not doing their job. Let's hear from all of them, and let's put pressure on those regulators. So that's my agenda for at least part of the new conference.
We do not have much time. We want to welcome former Congressman Brad Miller. I wanted to see, though, if there is a burning question, and I mean a question, Marshall.
Use mic, please, for posterity.
Professor Lazonick, you sort of buzzed through part of your presentation that seemed to be talking about sort of separating shareholding from management of corporations, and I think this is a subject that's like desperately needs to be discussed by a group like this. So I was wondering if you could kind of shed light on what you think that sort of proposal needs to be and why we would want to do that.
Very quickly.
Yeah, well, basically it's just historically the function of the stock market was to do precisely that. And in fact, it's a myth that even going back 100 years, that the rise of a large corporation was because you needed to raise capital. It was actually because you needed to have professional managers there to do the things that could build companies. What Elieen said broke down with the conglomerate movement, which is precisely correct. So, and shareholders were always just a way of separating ownership from control, because CEOs of companies are, after all, employees, and it's just a myth of the notion that shareholders invest in companies and that they should have some responsibility. They're really the least important people in companies.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Quick break, and we'll come back at 10:05. Thank you.
Unfortunately, I don't have a single one. I gave every one of them out at the LMT conference. I want to get some names of phone numbers and cards.
Oh, yeah.
My husband's having a big ceremony on campus today. So I just
Yeah. I'm actually really what would you consider the most important? I like that.
Well, yeah. So the reason that was done. No, I actually wrote it about
How are you doing?
good. Yeah. Yeah. Dean Stiller is out west. I get it done. Yeah. We done.
Actually, I didn't have a chance to look at it. I really relate to the website. A lot of data, if you read about engineering, is actually not really part of the real economy.
Yeah, first of all, productivity is
Okay.
and yeah, a lot of money is profits. It's not just profits. By profits, you could be real business.
Oh, yeah. You were saying,
But they have all these whole ways
yeah, okay. And then the other issue was wage spend. So who would you bring in?
So how can you explain it then? Because you point toward late 70s, early 80s.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, I think there was, the more I look at it, it was the World War I and who had unions, but and companies when they trained, first of all, you couldn't get people to do the jobs. There's a whole bunch of things. So basically,
No.
And that lasted until it started getting worse. And the rise of Silicon Valley was they were employed through fellow workers, and they were very friendly to the stock market. So sweet. But it was I've written a lot about how that whole thing arose. And in the process, actually, Silicon Valley is one of the innovation, but it's actually innovation is building on the old economy. Building on the corporate research labs, government spending, etc. Realize all the luxuries in mind. Hedge funds coming in, getting the stock price up, second time it's selling stock. And that's where all this buyback stuff.
Not gonna go for someone.
The problem isn't, a lot of people are discussing Apple. That's not people
Are there any similar?
and then people whatever job they play.
There's always been a farm.
All right, if I could ask you to take your seats.
Yeah, I'm so terrified.
Yeah. I will do.
When was that? Oh, right. Yeah. No, that's what
You can.
oh, you did? Yeah.
All right, if you could take your seats, let me just give a very quick introduction to our first keynote speaker this morning. He is Brad Miller, a member of Congress for 5 terms and a champion of financial reform and accountability. Something dear to my heart as a former member of the staff of the Banking Committee, as it then was in the House of Representatives. And he has, in the years since, been following the same path from the standpoint of a legal position here in Washington, D.C. So with great pleasure, let's welcome Congressman Brad Miller. Thank you.
Good morning. One of the peculiarities of serving in Congress is that you are frequently invited to address groups either here in Washington or back home and asked to speak about the issue that they are most concerned about, which really means that what they live and breathe, you've had a chance to read maybe a 3-page briefing paper that your staff prepared before you speak to them. So frequently, I never quite got over the oddity of speaking to a group that hung on every word I said when I was clearly the one in the room that knew the least about it. And so I generally try to avoid explaining things to people who clearly know it better than I do. When I do that, it is because I've forgotten momentarily who I'm talking to. I talked to Elizabeth Warren a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, and said that if the rule of law had been applied in the same way to the financial institutions involved in mortgage securitization that had been applied to the asbestos industry, the building supplies industry, we would have had a very different result. The leading building supply manufacturer 30 or 40 years ago was Johns Manville. It is still Johns Manville, but it's a different corporation. The corporation went into bankruptcy. All of the assets were sold, including the trade name Johns Manville, but it came out of bankruptcy with entirely different owners. And she nodded in agreement as I explained that. And later I realized, shit, I explained bankruptcy to Elizabeth Warren. Any of you don't know, before she went into politics, she was the nation's leading bankruptcy scholar. What I think I can, so I'm not going to explain how the deficits are to defile everything that is holy. Although that point of view does not stand me in good stead in North Carolina, where Erskine Bowles is considered an iconic figure. I will not try to explain how basic consumer services can be provided in post offices, but I will try to speak to something that I think probably I do know the most in the room about, and that is how politics works, how people get to Congress, how Congress works, how members of Congress learn or don't learn issues. I was elected in an old-fashioned way. I was not selected from Washington by consultants based upon some set of characteristics like central casting. I think this year, most years are looking for Iraqi war vets or someone with specific characteristics. I was a lawyer who had been in the state legislature. Those are the kind of folks that used to get elected to Congress, and I guess still sometimes do. And my experience in the legislature was with, and this is probably not just a difference in time, but a difference in place, but a difference in time. It was consensus driven. There was the expectation that things would be compromised, not in but in a pretty wholesome way. There was the expectation that everyone would literally get in a room together and talk it out and see if they could reach common ground. And the example that I remember, I was frequently assigned the task of sitting in, the task by the leadership, of sitting in any issue on the negotiations over any issues that affected the environment, because the environmentalists knew I was with them in my heart, but I would also tell them when I thought they had the losing side of an argument. And we were in negotiations over how to address abandoned, orphaned, leaking underground storage tanks. And I thought the leaking underground storage tanks issue might be interesting because the acronym made it sound that way. But that lost. That proved not to be the case. But the conversation got heated at one point. And the guy who was there, who owned a convenience store or something from the petroleum retailers, got exasperated and said, look, I'm sitting here and I'm going to work through this, but if you guys really irritate me, I may just go home. Because I don't have that much at stake. We don't have that much at stake. People need to buy petroleum products. People are not going to stop buying petroleum products, whatever you do. And if you apply a law that applies to all of us, and my competitors are going to have to pass along the same costs I have to apply to, I have to pass along. So I don't really have that much at stake. And I looked around the room, and everybody's head was nodding. They agreed with that. That was true. And when I came to Washington, I thought it would be that way here. I had an early conversation with Marion Barry. Not Marion Barry, the drug-addicted former mayor of Washington, but Marion Barry, who was then a congressman, a good old boy from Arkansas. And Marion explained how he got into politics. Marion didn't start out in politics. He was a rice farmer. He was a big rice farmer. They grow a whole lot of rice in Arkansas. And Marion and his brother were the state's two largest rice farmers. Bill Clinton, then governor, proposed legislation on water use. Well, rice farming uses an ungodly amount of water. And Marion and his brother didn't like it. So they went down to Arkansas, did Little Rock, they talked to the legislature, they killed it. 2 years later, Bill Clinton introduced the same bill. Marion and his brother went to Little Rock, killed it again. And then he got a call from Bill Clinton. They said, okay, you beat me twice. But one of these years, I'm going to get that bill passed, and you're not going to like it because you will not have had a thing to say about what's in that bill. Now, if you come down here to Little Rock and talk to me, maybe we can work it out. And Marion did. And they worked it out. And Marion and Bill Clinton became fast friends. And I thought, I can do this. I know how to do this. I was wrong. Washington could not be more different from the North Carolina legislature when I was in the legislature there, or from Arkansas politics when Marion Barry was wheeling and dealing with Bill Clinton. It is just fundamentally different. One thing is, unlike the petroleum retailers, the people who really lobby Congress are not doing something that has to be done. They're not providing a necessary good or service. They're in many cases doing something that is useless or worse, that is just extractive. And they aren't affected by market forces. They're not affected by supply and demand. There is no regulation by the marketplace, by the market. And second, it all is just about money. Some of you may know Art Wilmarth, who's a law professor at American.
GW.
Okay. He's a law, well, Bob knows it better than I do. But he wrote a long law review article. Art was just appalled at how many things Wall Street got passed when their arguments for those made no sense at all. And it was probably a 70-page law review article. I didn't read the whole article. I read the summary. That, law review articles are kind of hard to read, painful to read. And the summary, and I talked to Art about it, was that it was all because of money. Art, where have you been? How have you not figured that out? When I was first appointed to the Financial Services Committee, I would, as based on my experience in the legislature in North Carolina, I would sit down and listen to anybody want to come talk to me. And so I would hear the pitches from the Wall Street lobbyists. And I got to the point where only some issues, like that obscure issue that I picked as my own to understand, subprime mortgage lending, I could tell when what people were telling me made no sense at all. And that was frequently, if not always, the case when the lobbyists came to talk to me about subprime mortgage lending. But when it came time for the committee hearing, committee meeting, member after member would just puff themselves up and repeat almost word for word talking points that I had just heard in my office that I knew were nonsense. And I would look out to the back of the room where the lobbyists sat and see the lobbyists nodding with solemn approval that, yes, this is a member who has a sophisticated understanding of a complex topic. And that was about when I decided that gravitas was just Latin for pomposity. And that was what the debate was like in Congress. It was remarkably shallow. It was remarkably uninformed. And the truth was, people did not really want to be informed. That was not how they saw their job. And I wonder if it was different, Jamie, when it was different. Well, that's somewhat reassuring and somewhat discouraging. That's simply not the way it works now. And you probably have, you probably are wondering, how are these dumbasses really running the government? And the answer is no, they're not. But the problem is that the people who are running the government are perhaps worse. I assumed when the financial crisis hit, we got a new administration in 2008 election, beginning of 2009, that it would be like a New Deal. My father-in-law's, my late father-in-law was very bookish, so I inherited a lot of his old books, and he actually has a PhD in history. And I got the multi-volume Arthur Schlesinger books on the New Deal, on Franklin Roosevelt. So I took down and started reading the coming of the New Deal. And I'd say by February or March of 2009, I thought, I am reading the wrong book. So I went back and read the one before that, The Crisis of the Old Order, which was about the Great Depression and what led to the 1932 election. And that seemed to be much more apt to the circumstances I was dealing with. None Schreiber, who is now I think, reporter for the New York Times, but was a reporter for New Republic, wrote a profile of Valerie Jarrett, and he described the Obama administration in the early going. He said that the Clinton alumni Obama initially hired to run his White House and hash out his economic policy were flamboyantly centrist, fanatical about winning over financial markets and moderate voters. In their view, a Democratic president could make no bigger mistake than becoming a captive of the left, and they acted as if they owned the place.
Yes.
Well, I know pretty well, or knew pretty well, Obama's initial chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, and if Rahm Emanuel was picking people and telling them how to act, that's pretty much who he would have picked and how he would have told them how they would have told that. It is not that they lack native intelligence. It is not that they didn't go to good schools. It is not that they didn't get good grades. It is not that they weren't accomplished. They came from, they were partners at prestigious national law firms. They had gold on the resume, all over the resume. They were partners at prestigious investment banks. The problem was not lack of IQ. It was the culture, the fundamental understanding of who should win, who should not win, and how things should be decided. And they took it as a given that if you did not agree with them, it was because you lacked the sophisticated understanding. That decisions about the economy, how it is organized, who benefits, who loses, really should be decided by bloodless technocrats, not by some mouth-breathing politicians from the provinces, which were, as I just said, in fairness, dumbasses. But what they did instead, their assumption, unchallenged assumption, was that the most important thing to do in the aftermath of the financial crisis was to get the banks back to health, to help them pretend to be solvent until they really were, and that if 10 million families needed to lose their homes to foreclosure, rather than approach that problem with the kind of imagination and urgency that the New Deal approached that problem, well, that would be, it's unfortunate, but it was not unthinkable. Having major Wall Street institutions collapse, that was unthinkable. Now, that's probably you probably thought that was a pretty grim portrayal of Washington policymaking. And you were wondering what's the point of sitting up here and giving your presentations, your very scholarly presentations on what policy should be. And I can't promise you everything is going to be okay. I think that the best opportunity we had, remarkable opportunity we had in 2008 to 2009 to have essentially another New Deal, to have economic reforms that would have matched the New Deal in their imagination and their ambition. We have lost that opportunity, and it may take another financial crisis to have an opportunity like that. But the good news is these are not deeply rooted beliefs. If someone memorizes a talking point to give in 10 minutes in a committee hearing, they don't have a deeply rooted belief in that. They are easily dissuaded or persuaded to another set of talking points. One difference for those who believe in modern monetary theory may be the deep commitment to deficit reduction, or that worry about the debt, that was how you were seen as serious in Washington. You puff yourself up and you wring your hands about the debt. But for the most part, there's very little depth to any of this. And there is not kind of an incumbent establishment around certain issues that there was in 2016. The 2016 election I read Hillary Clinton's position papers on economic issues. One is on stock buybacks, where she described the problem perfectly, and her solution, and I say her, I mean, it was a policy apparatus, you know who they were. The solution was to require more frequent disclosure of stock buybacks. That is like the pill that Mother gives you in the Jefferson Airplane song. It doesn't do anything at all. And they didn't want to cross Wall Street. They didn't want to cross the substantial establishment that supported the buybacks. I think that things are disrupted now, and there is a potential to come forward with much more aggressive policies than were ever possible, and were certainly possible in 2016, or for a long time before that. And there are Democratic potential presidential candidates who already are there or are looking for things to be for. And that is a tremendous opportunity for much more imaginative policies that did not fit the previous orthodoxy. And second, I think there has to be an effort to get different people involved. We've got to have different people behind the doors when the doors close and the real decisions are made. And there was an effort like that in 2015 and 2016 that I was loosely part of. We were getting some friendly noises from some in the Clinton campaign that would presumably had a role in the Clinton transition, but I also had the impression that their hearts were not really in it. If we don't get different people with a different point of view, then I think we're going to have another set of policies like the ones that we've had before. Should we questions, or do we have time for that? All right, it's okay.
If I could just begin, I want to say on behalf of myself, I worked for Henry Royce, who was chair of the Banking Committee in the House. Pat Malloy is here, worked for Bill Proxmire, who was chair of banking in the Senate. You would certainly have been more at home in that company. Yeah. But on the other hand, we need you now.
I'm not there now.
Well, you're still with us. You're still with us, and you're in the spirit that both of us know from an earlier time.
I also think things have changed. I do know a lot of the reasons they've changed. I don't know how to make them change back.
I also want to thank you for the first ever reference at an EPS symposium to Jefferson Airplane. On that note.
What about oversight? Is there, hi, Dan from White House Watch. What about oversight? Is there positive potential in the next few years for useful oversight? And if so, where would you direct it?
It has to begin immediately. I've read the articles in the last couple of days. There was an article by, or column by Henry Littman in the New York Times this morning that I think does kind of give the quick cold shower that sending a subpoena does not mean you'll get the information requested. And I've been discouraged a little bit by the number of Democrats who are saying, well, we won't lead with investigations. You've got to lead with investigations because it is too easy to play out the clock. And this was also an issue I worked on. I was chairman of the Investigations and Oversight Subcommittee of the Science Committee and worked with the Judiciary Committee with House leadership on enforcing the subpoenas to Harriet Miers and to Josh Bolton. There was essentially, as the Harry Littman piece this morning said correctly, there are essentially three ways. One is criminal contempt, which is very similar to contempt of court. I mean, you subpoena something, they ignored your subpoena, that's contempt. But it requires prosecution by the executive branch. That's a big problem. The second is the traditional, and he seemed to think this was constitutionally suspect, but in fact it's well-grounded, is inherent contempt. The Congress just is coupled with civil contempt by a court is for to enforce compliance with the subpoena. And the effect of that is that somebody could be taken into custody and locked up until they do what they're supposed to do, until they obey the subpoena, or a court says under habeas corpus challenge that no, they're within their rights. And then the third is what we did in 2007, 2008, which was file a declaratory judgment action, get the court to issue its own subpoena, and then the court can enforce that. The problem with that, as Litton says, is that it does take time, so I think we need to get started now. I think the committees need to be sending letters now saying, we're not in the majority yet, but we will be, and this is what we're going to ask you for. We're asking for this from you now, and if you don't get it, we'll subpoena you quickly, and then we'll try to expedite the proceedings. But yes, I think that there is a wide range. I mean, I think every group in Washington is coming up with their list of what they want investigated, and it's not just Russia, Russia, Russia. And I'm sure that there are folks who would be very interested in your ideas for avenues for inquiry, but it needs to start soon. The Myers-Bolton lawsuit wasn't filed until 2008, and even with the proceedings expedited, there was not enough time to get a decision back within that Congress. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering, from your own personal and professional experience, how do priorities and key policies within the Democratic caucus in Congress get established?
Get what?
Established, get decided.
Decided. Well, that was sort of what I did. And I guess the gist of what I just said is they aren't decided by the rank and file members. They are decided more by leadership and senior staff, and when your party is in control, to a large extent by the administration. But I think that the other article in the last couple of days is that Pelosi is still dealing with the prospect that there will be enough members who would not vote for her, enough Democrats who would not vote for her on the floor, that she can't become Speaker, in which case things are in turmoil in the Democratic leadership for some time. I think that one of the reasons that there is an opportunity now to come forward with pretty imaginative ideas is that they aren't going to pass anyway. So you might as well propose them with the knowledge that they aren't going to pass. When I was in the state legislature, anything I introduced might get passed. That's a lot of pressure. I had to figure out whether it made sense or whether there's something wrong with it. And when I was in the House as a Democrat and as a Republican in the majority, I didn't feel that pressure. I could introduce something that I thought was worth talking about. But now's the time, perhaps. I just mentioned to Stephanie a minute ago that John Yarmouth is a smart guy. He's going to be in someone who I think his heart is in the right place. He'll be the Democratic chair of the Budget Committee. There's an opportunity to talk about setting spending priorities that don't assume that, oh my God, we can't run up the deficit. It's a crime against our children. What we usually hear about those topics. Yes.
Hi, I'm Steve Grumman with Real Progressives, and I want to thank you for your words today. I guess first things first, thank you very much for bringing up modern monetary theory. Okay. And second thing is, you said that the vast majority of these individuals are about thimble deep when it comes to the ideological, inclinations. But you also made mention that we had an opportunity for a New Deal under Obama that went the wayside. How much pressure could activists within this culture right now impact the ability to start advancing a far more aggressive dismantling of the Volcker rule, et cetera, and really, really pressuring on fiscal policy so that we can see a New Deal?
I think things have changed. In 2008 race, both Obama and Clinton were positioning themselves to be sensible centrists, and people didn't believe it of either one of them because she was a woman, he was African American. Diversity is how we judge how progressive someone is now. John Edwards, who is demographically very like me, we were born a month apart in adjoining counties. The problem with John Edwards was that in 2004 he had run as the Southern pro-business centrist, and then in 2008 he was trying to move left of both Clinton and Obama. He did everything short of saying the Internationale at campaign rallies to try to move to the left, and no one believed it. So there was not really a credible candidate in 2008 who was making those arguments, and the arguments didn't seem this important. You know, I mean, we didn't have the sense of how badly things had gone wrong that I think we have had since the 2008 crisis. So yeah, I think all of the candidates, those who now have credibility on these issues and those who don't, some of whom are very much acting like John Edwards, trying to move quickly to the left, despite a history that is not consistent with that. And I think both. Yeah, I polled a lot of the financial reform issues towards the end of the time I was in Congress. I thought, since I've done all this stuff, maybe I ought to see if people liked it, and they liked it. They liked the idea of breaking up the biggest banks, and the rationale given for that in the poll question was they have too much power, and we don't want to let them. We don't want to have to bail it out again. Overwhelmingly, I mean, it's hugely popular. The problem was nobody believed it. They didn't believe. I mean, they knew me a little bit, but I wasn't the national figure they saw on the news every night. I think both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have credibility already. I mean, they are authentic on this issue, and then the question is whether anyone believes what others say. But they're looking for issues that will differentiate themselves from others in the field. And I think the average consultant is entirely caught up in, what set of personal characteristics are we looking for. Do we want an Asian, African American woman? Do we want a African American former mayor? I mean, or a Latino mayor? Not really looking at the policy issues, but there is a policy debate there with a couple of people who are likely in the field who are very credible on the issue now already.
Very good.
Cookie.
So this is a follow-up question.
Okay.
I'm in your camp completely. I think we should call the New Democratic Program New Deal 2.0 or 21st Century New Deal or something like that. Medicare for All is a New Deal idea. They would have done it, except Roosevelt didn't think he could follow through and wanted to
He thought he
protect.
had to stop between Social Security.
Exactly. And I've heard this from many people. I go to Politics in Prose, to book talks, and the liberal wing of the Democratic people like Dean Baker, for example. Dean Baker, he's the head of, I forget what it's called. They give a talk sort of espousing New Deal types of things. There was another talk at the AFL-CIO last year, and I go up and I say, well, you're really agreeing with Bernie Sanders, aren't you? And I was a Bernie Sanders person. And they look confused and upset, and they say, well, no. Like, who could ever consider someone like that? Or Elizabeth Warren. And I was a fan of Elizabeth Warren from the day she published the bankruptcy study about medical expenses. Why do they do that? Why do they just simply write off Bernie Sanders like he comes from the moon, and Elizabeth Warren because she's too shrill? I mean, even Rubin.
Yeah.
doesn't care for Elizabeth Warren, and I don't understand why not.
And actually, ill-advisedly, he has used the word shrill, and it has been explained to him that that is not a good thing to say about a woman.
Right.
And I think he's not saying shrill anymore. He's probably saying strident.
What is?
I don't know all the reasons. I think that there is an establishment. That's not just something that people outside of politics who don't know it just say. There is a policy establishment, and they are very protective of their own turf, their own status. And I think most people thought. I didn't take a position in the 2016 election. If Warren had run, with whom I worked very closely on a lot of issues, I would have supported her. I was very pleased with Bernie's campaign, but I started out, as most people did, I think including Warren, and I think including Bernie, thinking he'd be a message candidate. He'd be the Dennis Kucinich of 2016. And Dennis, no disrespect to Dennis, but he never broke above 5%. And okay, but Bernie got 43% of primary vote and 47% of the pledged delegates. I think if he'd started out thinking, I might really win this sucker, he might really have won that sucker. And I think Warren would have. And she decided that she was getting enough discouragement from the people who seemed to know that, and I don't know, I never talked about it, so I don't know what all I think it was. Making the decision to run for office or not, and I've made both decisions, is a pretty big personal thing. But yeah, we're going to hear that. We're going to, and I'm very skeptical. I'm very cynical about the descriptions of people's personalities, because what we think of someone aligns greatly with what we think of their politics. And I think there's been a pretty organized effort to call Elizabeth Warren a difficult personality. I know her pretty well. Maybe it's a reflection of how difficult my personality is. Actually, the great phrase of the establishment, particularly the Geithner Treasury and the Obama and the, I should say, Rahm Emanuel White House, is team player. Yeah, I wasn't a team player. They thought I was a team player. I was playing for a different team. I was playing for Elizabeth Warren's team, and Sheila Bair's team. I was playing for the girls' team. But that's the kind of it becomes personal and all personal attacks. In Southern politics, and maybe this is true in the rest of the country, in the African American community now, one of the methods to judge, or one of the bases for judging white candidates, is, do they feel comfortable with black people? And I thought, we all grew up in the South. We've known people since we were knee high to African Americans, and then I saw the clip of Romney, of Mitt Romney, with a group of African American men. I thought, he was going to jump out of his skin. But that is something that the establishment political activists, African American political operatives, say that about the politicians they don't support. Oh, he's not comfortable with white people.
On that note, Congressman, thank you very much.
So we're running a little behind. We need to move quickly into the next panel. I think they're all ready to jump up and go.
All right.
No break.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe short of it. Oh, here's
I'd say go ahead and start as soon as you are comfortable.
There you go.
All right, so I guess we'll start this the next panel. This sort of flow quite smoothly out of the previous panel. Two of the panelists are sort of longtime personal heroes of mine, and another I'm sure is destined to become such a personal hero. Most of you probably know Jeff Madrick. I sometimes think of him as sort of the successor to Jamie's father in essentially rendering economics and economic policy accessible to a general readership without, in so doing, sacrificing rigor or detail. Emma Coleman Jordan is sort of a pioneer, if not indeed the founder, of the sort of academic study of banking and finance from a social justice point of view. And then Marshall Steinbaum, who's a bit too young to be quite as venerable or storied as his co-panelists, nevertheless does fantastic work at the Roosevelt Institute, and I suspect that that's destined to become just as important and well-known over time as is Jeff's and his work. So with that, we'll get started, and I guess we'll proceed from right to left in a kind of a hopeful trajectory. So we'll start with I mean, from your point of view, right? So we'll start with Jeff, and then to Emma, and then over to Mike.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate the introduction. Thank you for inviting me. Appreciate being here. It's been quite an interesting symposium so far. I hope we can keep it going. I need my glasses. So I'd like to begin with it. Well, I'd like to begin with a couple of points. I'm going to not follow Elieen. I've just been reading Alice O'Connor, if anybody knows the poverty historian, so Alice in my mind. But Elieen talked about how she would not talk about her agenda, and then she gave us her entire agenda at the end, which I appreciate, because I think was on comment. I want to say one thing about Big Short, the movie. Anybody who relies on the movie Big Short is being misled. You better read the book. It's way more complex and accurate than the movie. The movie was an unfortunate distortion. I wanted to tell Elieen that in 1974 or something long after I got out of grad school, I wrote my first cover story. It was for Business Week, and it was called The Rise of the CFO. So it was already happening. And it's a direct line to what's happening today. So I just wanted to make a couple of points. There were a couple of other points, but I'm sure they're superfluous. I'm a little disappointed by the Democrats already. I think they are not, contrary to what ex-congressman said, they are not attacking the problem. They don't seem to fully appreciate the problem. I think healthcare is a very important issue, and it won a lot of votes, so I'm glad about that. They talk about infrastructure and talk about not believing things. Nobody in America quite believes we're going to get an infrastructure package. We haven't gotten one, and we need it desperately. What they should be talking about, what the main issue is, and I think it's been referred to, they should be talking about jobs and wages in America. That's why Donald Trump ran. He ran partly because he gave an opening to vulgarity, which I suppose is a deep part of the human character, racism, the hatred for Obamacare, which was about the most irrational thing I'd seen in a while. That's turned because people now know they benefit from Obamacare. Maybe we'll get a public option. But the real issue is wages and jobs and bitterness over wages and jobs. And he appealed to that with talk about tariffs and so forth. Democrats have to come out of the chute talking about jobs and wages, pure and simple. I don't want to oversimplify, but I guess I am. There has to be a program to tell people Democrats are going to get them jobs. Now, there's a problem there, of course, and it was alluded to earlier. The problem is the deficit. People think you can't talk about social programs, and the ex-congressman tells us, well, maybe that's opening up a little bit. I sure hope so. The Obama administration, centrist as they were, joined the argument for austerity, and that cost us dearly.
Yes.
Don't think they didn't join the argument for austerity, and don't think they were just pushed by the Republicans to do that. Erskine Bowles was the Democratic representative on the Balanced Budget Committee, named before Obama even became president. That was not a response to Republican pressure. That was a response to something in the president's mind and his economic advisors, and I suppose Rahm Emanuel, that it's something they had to abide by, and it was good economic policy. It hurt us terribly because we didn't get social policies we need, and we now face a very big deficit. How are we going to get those social policies? I think the Democrats better have a little meeting to talk about that, because that's going to be a big issue. And I think they are avoiding jobs and wages talk because they don't want to deal with that problem. They don't want to deal with what the government spent. There's been an abdication of responsibility, I believe, on the part of progressive economists because they haven't really explained this economic, the strength of the economy so far. There's a lot of talk about a sugar high. There have always been sugar highs. I don't think it's only a sugar high. I think a lot of it is
this guy is really
Keynesianism. A big deficit leads to rapid economic growth. And we haven't hit a point where higher interest rates might undermine that growth. I don't think that's likely. I think it might undermine the stock market, which is an indirect way of undermining economic growth. And in fact, I'm not so sure the president is going to enjoy this economic ride. But in any case, without a clear theory about what's going on, without a notion about how important it is to have social programs, and by and large ignore the deficit to the extent you can, we're not going to get what we need. And if we get what we need, partly if we do start getting better jobs and higher wages, we'll start paying some of that, we'll start ameliorating some of that deficit. But the point is the American people need this, and we need this more than we need lower deficits. I think the argument, as Elieen said, we know the agenda we need. The agenda we need includes dealing with labor rules, like overtime rules, like fairness of schedules and so forth.
Speaking is Jeff Madrick, M-A-D-R-I-C-K.
Labor organizing. Business has beat the heads. It's not even really an issue in the media, but business beat the heads of labor union organizers across the nation with the support of the federal government by and large. The minimum wage is over time, we've got to get to $15 an hour. I don't think there's any doubt. And it's a critical pillar of the future. I think we've got to start talking about industrial policy openly. That's a good example of what was suppressed over the last 15 or 20 years. You couldn't talk about industrial policy. I remember Felix Rohatyn, who was not an anti-capitalist by any means, trying to talk. This was a guy who made a lot of money, who helped New York out of debt, who was widely regarded, was not necessarily Mr. Purity. In fact, probably most of you don't know this. He used to be called Felix the Fixer in his former incarnation. It came out strongly for, I think, decent politics. He wanted to be on the Fed board, and they weren't going to let him be on the. They weren't going to let him be vice chairman of the Fed. He used to try and get industrial policy into the general argument. It was a dirty phrase. He couldn't do it. Industrial policy means subsidies for manufacturing, for green technology, for some healthcare and R&D support. It means a government that is active and recognizes that private enterprise won't do it all, and in fact, it never did do it all. And I think Mazzucato's books, or now 2 books, are good guides to how important government was in the development of innovation that eventually led to productivity growth. We should keep that. You don't have to read it. Take my word for it. Government matters a lot, and in this regard. So we need this industrial policy. We need infrastructure. We have to talk more about how we can actually get it and what it will actually mean and how it can produce fair jobs for all, men, women, and people of color. And we have to talk about income supports. What distresses me most is we are not coming up with policies for the lower end, for the service workers who don't make a lot of money. There's been some legislation put forward. I don't know if it's going to pass for home health care workers and so forth. The Democrats really have to turn their attention to helping these people and figuring out ways to support income. There are differences about this in the left-wing camp. Annual minimum benefits or cash allowances or job guarantees. I like job guarantees. We have to have a robust debate about that. It has to be a priority in the Democratic agenda. Paid family leave, of course, has been a priority. We're not getting it. We're not getting it anywhere. And I want to say one other thing. I want to add to Eileen's comments about finance. Finance really did, and I think you're going to address this. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but finance really did suppress wages. The leading edge were the leverage buyouts, which began in the 1970s and grew in the 1980s, and then became private equity, which is by and large the same thing. You borrow all that money, and in order to pay the debt back, you suppress wages or fire people or strip the company and stop paying an R&D. Eileen's been a leader in the research on this, but there's been no question it's been a major contributor to low wages. So is Federal Reserve policy, which was until a couple of years ago too tight for this economy and led to wage suppression. Indeed, the objective was wage suppression. I think some of that's reversed, thank goodness. And I want to say one thing about poverty, which is never discussed in regard to the economy. There is a huge, especially child poverty. Just finishing up a book on child poverty, which is, as you know, the highest or almost the highest among rich countries, highest rate among rich countries in the world today. And it's 14 or 15% in America. If poverty were measured properly, it would be more like 25%. One of the great scandals in America, of course, is the official poverty rate is an immoral, unsophisticated, ridiculous measure. And that's only now being talked about. What I'm trying to get at is poor people are a great potential resource for the economy of America and to increases in productivity, and especially poor children. And what we're essentially doing is cutting off. So it's not 25%. We're cutting off 15% of the population from contributing adequately to this economy. It's a great unused resource. So let's think about poverty. The wonderful historian Michael Katz called poverty the third rail of politics. Nowhere was that clearer than in the recent Democratic campaign, where poverty was hardly mentioned, and though allegedly the main interest of the Democratic contender was child poverty, that contender hardly mentioned it. In fact, I think she only came up with a proposal 3 weeks before Election Day. That's an economic issue. It's foremost a moral issue and an issue of minimizing, ruining kids' lives, but it's a major economic issue. So I'm going to start there. I want to quickly say, let's talk about housing also. The housing policy in America is a travesty, and I better not fall into the trap of trying to mention everything that has to be done. I was asked to do the New Deal, And the New Deal covered an extraordinary amount of territory. Extraordinary. We have as many problems today, though people are not suffering as much for the most part, but they are all critical problems. I'm going to stop on what I think is the critical problem: wages and jobs. Thank you.
That was Jeff Madrick of the Century Foundation.
It's a pleasure.
This is Emma Coleman Jordan of Georgetown Law.
It gives me an opportunity to pull together new thoughts and to reflect on the things you've said. I want to focus my attention. I do regulation banking, and I've taught for more than 30 years and written in the area of secured transactions and commercial law. I also have written a case book on the idea of economic justice, race, identity, and culture, how this pervades the way in which we approach problems and how this creates gaps. So for this set of comments, I've got a couple of 4 points that I want to start with, and then I want to go into my major theme. I've been told 12 minutes. I'm going to keep it to 12 minutes, so I may be hitting some of these quickly. First point is, in advice to the Congress, beware of financial innovation. And the idea of innovation is a mask for exploitation, avoidance of regulation, capture of the levers of power to dismantle bad actors. Secondly, there is old wine in old bottles. Watch out for the return of the radical deregulatory agenda. It hasn't gone away. We still hear, even from Democrats, faint whispers that sound amazingly like radical deregulatory agenda, soft regulation. Capital requirements, they are good, but then when you get to the point of enforcement and oversight, we find that the very largest banks, with the bank supervisors at the Fed, this summer, they were taking the stress tests, and we learned that the Fed was coaching them how to pass the test, how to rejigger their balance sheets so that the tests could be passed. So there are various forms of radical deregulatory agenda. It isn't always the face of Alan Greenspan. Even he admitted under withering questioning by Waxman that maybe he made a mistake in his fundamental assumptions. Well, that seemed to be a personal confession, because the economists, many of whom are not here, that the ideas are still firmly embedded in the discipline. The third point I want to just touch on, mention it, and then I'll go through some examples in a minute. Beware of racial exploitation that is posing as new opportunity, that people who are excluded from financial transactions now have the opportunity to participate. Well, I was at a conference at Georgetown just recently in the last couple of weeks, and one of my idols in the economics profession is George Akerlof. And George is very clear. His book, Fishing for Fools, is about what happens when you take off the regulatory guardrails, that the natural state of the market is not simply patterns of competition, rational choice, efficiency, but instead predation. And so in predicting who will be preyed upon, you have to know our racial history. You have to know how our country has been built, how the economic structure is supported by continuing predation. So this leads me to the last overview point, and that is, don't be enthralled by the discredited economic expertise that is embedded in fancy macroeconomic models. These models look good until they're put to the test of predicting something real. Interest rates, maybe, but not the collapse based on racial exploitation and predation. So let me go on now to talk about my central comment, and that is financial complexity is not an accident. It was great to hear the congressman talk about the way in which a lot of the proposals that led up to the financial crisis didn't make any sense at all. And some people think that was an accident. I don't think it was an accident. It was a central strategy of the financial sector. The financial sector relied upon two disciplines primarily, economics and the quants in mathematical models. And their reliance then gives them the expertise and advantage of creating complexity that Louis Ranieri told the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, nobody will understand this. Well, again, that wasn't an accident. That was a built-in feature to create financial instruments that were impenetrable. So that strategy is built upon another layer, and that layer is the power of disciplinary training and the grip on ideas of disciplinary training in economics or mathematics. I had a student, about 5 years ago. He and I got to be very close. He took a couple of classes of mine. He was a quant on Wall Street. His basic training was as a person who was doing physics. Well, he told me, we started talking about things related to the financial crisis, and he said to me, he said, you know, those models that quants use were not intended to do financial prediction work. They were intended to describe and make assessments of the movement of molecules, the way in which physical science operates. And then quants, of course, looking for the major advantage of working on Wall Street, the compensation and the advantage which that gave them, they flooded out of those laboratories, and they could have their own areas of control within the major financial companies. So complexity is an intentional power-grabbing strategy, and it is reinforced by the disciplinary grip on ideas. I'm always surprised to see that many of the macroeconomic maxims are still in charge of most of the thinking in regulatory agencies. And so when we hear that nobody could have predicted